So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to convene the panel entitled Hard Cases Enforcing the Rules. This panel is perhaps less, I don't want to say less coherent, but I'm sure both of my colleagues here are wonderfully coherent speakers, but we're actually doing two different things in this panel. First, we're going to turn to J.D. Maddox and look at one additional arena of the commons that we had not yet discussed. So I think it was teased up nicely by Ron Marks and Jamil Jaffer. We had thought of Jamil as giving us cyber as a platform, as a technology, and J.D. Maddox is one of the applications of that commons is this explosion of artificial intelligence, disinformation, et cetera. So an application that cyber enables. And are there going to be any rules or regulations or attempts to govern this capability? And you'll maybe tell us whether you think it belongs as one of the global commons or not. But we're then going to turn to our wonderful new colleague at the Schar School, Luis Rodriguez, whose research work has always been on the Global South. And I have to say, you are working in an arena that's only going to get bigger and more important. We listened to the UN Secretary General saying, UN reform is all about making the UN system more fair and more inclusive of the views of the Global South. We've seen the expansion of the BRICS. We've seen so many indicators that the power alignments in a multipolar world are creating very different opportunities and realities for countries of very different sizes and scales. So while we in an advanced Western country that used to be the single superpower can think about the world as organized around great power competition, I want us to step back, widen the aperture, and say, yes, there's great power competition, but there's also the rise of the voice and the power and the influence of the Global South. So we're going to turn to Luis to help us sort of think about the Global South and the global commons. So how do different groups of countries, perhaps, or individual countries, respond to some of the things that we've been talking about today on the commons? And after they've each shared some opening remarks, I will try to come up with some questions that maybe connect the two, and then open to you for a good discussion. I've been very pleased with the questions have been wonderful this morning, so I'm counting on you to find ways to connect our two speakers here. So just to be clear, J.D. Maddox also teaches both at the Schar School, a very popular course on disinformation and AI, and he has also taught in the communications part of the School of Engineering. So we're delighted to have him. He is the CEO of Inventive Insights, a national security consultancy, and really is a great thinker about this 21st century problem set. So JD, I'm going to turn to you first, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Do I have to push this? No? Okay.
Nope. Oh.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. A little background. So I've worked on information operations or influence operations for decades in support of the CIA, the Army's psychological operations units, and the State Department's Global Engagement Center. And I have to say that, having watched the dynamics of the information environment over those decades, the emergence of generative AI really is a game changer. And I think about it in terms of the disinformation that it offers to develop and automate, and that's a pretty scary opportunity for us as the U.S. and for our multilateral partners. So I've got a few prepared remarks here, but I really look forward to the questions that you guys issue. So from the top, my bottom line up front, as they say, is that sovereign states' competing unilateral positions will probably make it extraordinarily difficult for multilateral institutions to develop realistic prohibitions against AI abuses, especially misuse for disinformation and deception. In all recent communications related to AI, the U.S. has prioritized its global economic competitiveness, eschewing strong prohibitions on misuses of generative AI. All past U.S. legislation against misuses of tech for disinformation, for example, have failed or are now hung up in litigation. The EU itself stepped out with the EU AI Act this summer, prioritizing investment and support for AI while giving some lip service to prohibitions on the misuse of AI. And China supported new AI research while prohibiting misuses of generative AI in a new law last week. Notably, the original edict's punitive financial measures were stripped from the final document, which means to me that they have stepped back from a strong prohibition of the misuse of these tools. Multilateral approaches remain nebulous so far, with overlapping initiatives underway. For its part, it appears the UN is lagging behind other multilateral organizations. Optimistically, we could say that organizations are taking a circumspect approach, gathering data before making smart decisions. Pessimistically, we could say that at this rate, these organizations are unlikely to develop policies that keep up with tech changes and threats. A few indicators. A recent multilateral statement of principles against the misuse of AI came from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, a good step forward. The UN's Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights has also spoken in favor of basic human rights amid AI changes, also a good step forward, but really nominal. Meanwhile, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has issued statements of principle and has developed its Dis-Miss Resource Lab. Those are actual steps, a little bit further along than the UN's. And at this year's G7 summit, the group agreed to discuss governance and interoperability for trustworthy AI and establish the Hiroshima AI process for development. G7 completed its Hiroshima AI process stock-taking survey exercise last week. These multilateral efforts will likely result in ethical norms, but not in real prohibitions. Instead of enacting clear, enforceable prohibitions on the misuse of AI, states and multilateral institutions seem to be reminding citizens of the underlying legal prohibitions against the misuse of these technologies. Those prohibitions include extortion, harassment, impersonation, copyright infringement, misinformation, privacy infringement, defamation, broader fraud issues, and more. Those are basic legalities that are already in place. However, there are numerous practical technological countermeasures, such as authentication tech, inoculation tech, and digital investigations that will likely be implemented unilaterally in the near term. And for a little context, authentication technology essentially is a tool that is embedded in your machine that every time you take a picture or issue a piece of content, it watermarks digitally that content so that the originator of that content is known to its recipient. So it's one layer of authentication of the content. Inoculation technology, very different. Inoculation is the idea that if you prepare people to encounter disinformation and propaganda in the wilds of the internet, then they'll be more likely to defend themselves against it. In Cambridge University studies of inoculation tools, such as Harmony Square, which was developed by the State Department, they ruled that, or assessed that it had a 24% increase in, that players of Harmony Square improved their ability to identify disinformation by 24%. So that's a actual measurable outcome. And then finally, digital investigations. I think these are probably well known to everybody. There are organizations out there very broadly, everybody from Anonymous all the way over to Graphica, who are day in, day out looking at this problem. How is AI being used for harm, and what should we potentially do about it? So I think that these countermeasures will likely be implemented by civil society first, with some state funding. And states will likely continue to prioritize monitoring and reporting functions over deliberate interventions. And finally, I'm sorry to say that it appears the much maligned U.S. Code 230 will likely be a reference for U.S. policy and legislation development against misuses of AI. USC 230 relieves internet-based information platforms from responsibility for the content appearing there and has been a basis of laissez-faire platform monetization. When I read policy documents related to AI, it seems to me that they are all repeating the basic justification behind USC 230. We must give industry the freedom to profit from these advances, and we will deal with the implications later. The White House's recent call for entirely voluntary commitments by U.S. industry to manage risks posed by AI is a great example. This predominant neoliberal approach and our U.S. politicians' equally powerful complaints about apparent executive branch censorship efforts are a Scylla and Charybdis, blocking the way for effective policy. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a lot there, and I didn't understand it all. So if you'll just indulge me for one or two follow-ups. So this notion of stock taking, we heard that in the panel earlier in the day, that countries have to kind of voluntarily do a self-assessment, like we all have to evaluate ourselves for annual reviews, things like that. Can you tell us more about this Hiroshima stock taking, and how could it possibly have been finished so quickly? Or was it tasked to the countries, to the G7 countries, long before they actually convened in Hiroshima?
I think there was, sorry, I can't tell if this, I think there was a real sort of sensation around AI during the G7 meeting, and the Hiroshima process stood up really quickly. And what I saw was that, internal to state and other organizations, there was a really rapid response to the requirement for that stock taking. And even before then, organizations within our own U.S. Government organizations were thinking through doing their own stock taking, figuring out where are where do the principles lie, but also where are the organizations that they're most likely to, multilateral organizations that the U.S. is most likely to work with on this issue. Because it does seem to me that there's a bit of tension between the different multilateral organizations where, again, the UN is far behind G7 and OECD, and it's almost like a jockeying for position. So I think unilateral states, individual states are sort of trying to find a way to sync with these multilateral organizations.
So stock taking is an inventory of your own kind of domestic legal framework, or is it more about your cooperation with existing international bodies?
I think it's a little bit of everything. So stock taking includes, first of all, taking stock of the principles you already have in place. What are the laws that you already abide by or that you recognize in this space? What are the norms that you recognize in this space, and how would you operate as a state or as a multilateral organization abiding by those? And then also, yes, more deeply, what are the programs that are in place unilaterally that sync with the multilateral organization, and how would those actually work in unison with other government agencies?
So I want to come back to this question of the UN versus other multilateral organizations, because I think it's kind of an intriguing theme for our day of which parts of the global governance mechanisms work and which are less effective. But let's invite Luis to offer his opening remarks. And you've got a very wide, what is it, half the world, 2/3 of the world that you represent now? So take us where you want to go on explaining how some different categories of countries of the Global South look at these issues, and then we'll open it up.
Perfect. Should I do anything?
I don't think so. No, they're going to turn it on for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, let me start by thanking CSPS and thanking Ellen for the invitation. So today, I'm going to be talking about basically how small states, the Global South, approach governing the commons. And I think this is my bias showing, but I think it's especially important to study this because studies of international security and global governance in general, they usually focus on either powerful countries or powerful non-state actors as the ones making the rules. And the usual suspects here as rule makers are the US as one of the great powers, the superpower at some point, alliances like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, rising powers like China, or even some powerful non-state actors like SpaceX and the construction of rules in space, for example. And these accounts are helpful in understanding the broad picture of global security governance. But I think that they sometimes offer incomplete interpretations about these efforts for governing the commons. And one blind spot that they have is that they don't give us many tools or useful tools to understand the interests and the actions of states and non-state actors from the global south. Let me give you just one example. Analysts paying attention to the global nuclear order usually focus on nuclear powers, and we do reason. We need to understand how are these countries competing, how are they cooperating, what are they doing with the nuclear arsenals. And these accounts pay attention to the global south, to their actions sometimes. They try to explain, for example, why developing countries and small states respect, comply with, or challenge non-proliferation and disarmament rules. And they pay special attention to those countries that have the capabilities, potentially could have the capabilities, to build nuclear arsenals. However, this analysis usually downplay or sometimes even ignore the global governance interests, actions, and the initiatives of the countries in the global south. In other words, analyses usually portray the global south as passive audiences, supporters, sometimes challengers, but not so much as agents with their own interests or their own initiatives when it comes to creating these global rules for controlling nuclear arsenals or disarming countries. And because of this bias, it's not surprising that analysts, they don't always understand why the global south complains or even criticizes global nuclear governance. And that is something that we saw last year during the review process of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example, with a lot of analysts suddenly not understanding why the global south was complaining about disarmament, and then suddenly also not understanding why the global south stayed silent and actually let the NPT go through in order to create a common document. And I get why these analyses don't pay a lot of attention to the global south. This is a category that encompasses an extremely diverse group of countries. And global security on its own also entails already a lot of different domains and a lot of different issues. So analysts cannot focus on all of this diversity. They cannot pay attention to everything, everywhere, all at once. And my challenge today is to give you a brief overview of this diversity in less than 10 minutes. So buckle up. Let me start by talking about some common interests among small powers and countries in the global south when it comes to governing the commons. The first one is that they agree that there is a need for predictability. They need laws, norms, or organizations that will help provide this certainty. Even if actors break the law, they would argue you can at least, if you have a law, say that something was illegal. And that could help you to get some support. This is a case, for example, in the Law of the Sea efforts and how people or different countries understand that maybe China will break the rules, maybe the US will not accept some of these rules, but at least you have a rule in the books that you can point to and say that a great power is breaking. And that could help you get some support from other countries. The second point is that these countries agree that there is a need to share the costs of maintaining the commons. And they agree that multilateral organizations help to share this cost of maintaining the commons, especially because these are countries that don't have the power of their own to create stability in the global commons. They also want multilateral organizations to make sure that everyone benefits from the commons, but also to potentially prevent the monopolization or the creation of clubs in these commons, and to prevent the unilateral establishments of regulations. This is the case, for example, with the Kyoto Protocol and the need to have a multilateral setting, at least to have some idea of how to regulate the environment, to prevent the monopolization of some resources by some countries. This is also the case with the responsibility to protect and different norms promoting humanitarian intervention to prevent the unilateral enforcement of some rules. This is the idea that if you do it collectively, you might prevent great powers doing it on their own. There is also an agreement that there is a need to prevent club goods. So here's the fear that first movers will get to carve exclusionary spaces for themselves, leaving these smaller countries with less resources out. This is one of the logics, for example, behind the outer space treaties, in this idea that maybe I don't have the technology or the resources right now to go into a space, so let's create some rules to prevent the monopolizations of those spaces. And there is also a need to prevent the securitization of the commons. These countries recognize that conflict will emerge over the commons. It's not that harmony of interest will exist over these spaces. So these countries fear that powerful actors, when conflict emerges, they will use force to resolve those different conflicts. So they want to prevent that from happening. And for that, they want to have some rules about how to peacefully resolve conflicts. This is something that is happening, for example, in the regulation of best practices in cyberspace or also in space. And finally, these countries, most of them agree, there is not a complete consensus, but most of the Global South agrees that there is a need to extend the laws of war to the emerging commons. Here, these countries understand, especially with new technologies, that new commons will emerge. And the main fear of most countries in the Global South regarding emerging technologies is that they might increase the indiscriminate lethal capacity of arsenals. And they seek to create minimum regulating principles to prevent this scenario, including ensuring that a human defines targets and decides when to use a weapon, establishing significant and effective control of this human making decisions to guarantee the responsibility, and finally, proving that the effects of a weapon can be directed exclusively and specifically toward legal military targets. All of these principles of the law of war that those countries have been participating in codifying since the 1930s. So they want to take something that already exists and use it in these potentially new emerging commons. So that was the side of the things in common that these countries have. But this doesn't mean, though, that there is harmony within the Global South about the global commons. There is a lot of diversity in how these countries think about this. So let me turn in the last 2 minutes and a half that I have to the points of disagreement that these countries have. The first one, they don't know if they can trust great powers. There is a suspicion that great powers, especially Western powers, have benefited from the international order for way too long, and that they won't agree to give up their privileges. And this is something that keeps happening, and we keep hearing when we talk about the UN reform. We just hear about it this week, with all of these countries saying that the Western powers have had it good for too long, and that they are not going to give up that responsibility and share it with new emerging powers. So there is a debate there within the Global South whether you can work with great powers or not. Second point of disagreement, how much inequality is acceptable? Here, there is an understanding that more powerful actors, they sometimes need more rights or more privileges or maybe more room of maneuver so that they can bear the cost of maintaining the commons. A small country cannot do it on its own. Great powers, maybe they can do it more, so let's give them a little bit more free range. But how many rights should they have? And for how long should they have these rights is a dividing issue within the Global South. And this is something that we hear, for example, with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Reform, with a lot of countries saying that in the 60s, they decided to give up acquiring nuclear technologies, especially peaceful nuclear explosions back in the 60s, in exchange for these countries disarming at some point, and they haven't done it. So how much longer are we going to accept this status of inequality is a question dividing the Global South. On a related note, these countries also disagree on how much should we let great powers have flexible interpretations of the rules. And these countries use a lot of the hypocrisy charge against these countries by basically saying that some rules apply to all of the Global South, but not to the great powers, and that is unfair. And this is something that we keep hearing when it comes to, for example, the International Court of Justice, with a lot of different African states actually thinking of stepping out because they see the enforcement of these rules targeting leaders in the African continent, but not what they see as war criminals in Western countries. We even saw Brazil last week saying that maybe they will also get out of the ICG. So this is not something only permeating the African continent, it's also permeating other regions. Let me speed up a little bit. Third point.
We've got plenty of time.
Oh, perfect. I will slow down a little bit. There is also a question of how much should we sacrifice for the common good? And here, there is this idea that great powers have gotten to the place where they are at in the different international hierarchies because they were first movers. They were able to, for example, pollute the environment more when they were industrializing. And now that the environment is in the state that it is, these are the countries asking rising powers to slow down a little bit because of the common good. These countries see that maybe catching up will have some costs, and they don't know if they want to stop developing, to stop rising, in order for the environment to be less polluted, in order to do it for the common good. And finally, the last question that divides these countries is what to do when my capabilities improve. As capabilities increase, the interests of countries also increase, and their expectation that the common practices that great powers have been using will also apply to them is there. With new interests, they also want more flexibility in how the rules apply to them. And this is something that we see with the BRICS, where they basically have this new capabilities, they have these new interests, and they want to be held to the same standard that some great powers had, including those charges of hypocrisy that sometimes they use against great powers. So finally, those are all the points that I had. The last point that I have is a shameless plug over here. If you were interested in all of these topics, I'm actually going to be teaching a course next semester on the Global South and international security, where we will delve deeper into all of these different points. But thank you for the invitation again.
Okay. Thank you so much. Really interesting. So I want to pin you down a little bit on your definitions. Do you use the phrase Global South to be roughly coterminous with what used to be called the non-aligned movement? Is it different? Is India in or out? And so your last point about when countries rise in terms of metrics of economic success and even metrics of power, are they still in the Global South? I mean, is the South a sort of socioeconomic dividing line, or is it pure geography? Or is it, and is it self-selecting? Do countries decide whether they want to call themselves Global South or not?
This is a great question, and this is a question that a lot of Global South theories actually don't have an answer for. I think that the best answer that someone has given recently was from last week, Amrita Narlikar, who is this professor in Germany, published a piece defending the concept of the Global South by basically saying that as academics, we need to find the commonalities in all of the different actors that we put into a category. She acknowledges that there is a lot of diversity within the Global South. We don't know if this is economic, we don't know if this is political, we don't know if this is an ideological category. But that at least by grouping these countries, however you want to define them, within this category, you can find their commonalities and their differences. But it's a very contested concept.
Does India consider itself Global South?
When it's useful for them.
China?
When it's useful for them.
Yes.
So, for example, Mexico has this category of a country with multiple identities, which is a category that a lot of countries in the Global South would use.
Oh, really terrific, and I really encourage students. I want to take the class, so I hope other people will as well. But it really gets to some of the fault lines in the politics and the power distribution in the international system. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, we really do want to go beyond just looking at the world as now, as the U.S. government declares its great power competition. That is not sufficient, and it's not satisfactory to understand the international politics and international security. But the Global South has multiple agendas and multiple opportunities to impose some of its collective authority. So to what extent do you also think that there's an understanding that if we work together, you know, collectively we have more clout than if we make kind of unitary appeals to, you know, if you're I don't know, Sri Lanka, and you ask the Indians to help represent you in an international forum. I mean, people can look to who are their benefactors, friends, donors in the developed world, or they can group up together. And how formal and coherent is that grouping up together?
So let me give you an example from my own research. I studied regulations of arsenals. And in the recent conversations on lethal autonomous weapon systems and how to regulate them, there is this idea of we should do it together. Because if we don't do this together, the great powers who are developing this, they are going to enforce their rules. So let's talk in unison. But there is a lot of fighting there. So even in Latin America, for example, these countries want to have regulations on laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems. And they want to do it in a way that respects best practices. They don't know where to go to do it. Half of these countries, the ones that are not in the non-aligned movement, they want to do it piece by piece, have different conversations, different forums. The ones that are in the non-aligned movement, they want to do it through the UN, through the Conference of Disarmament, which famously has not come to a consensus in the last 20 years. Because they feel like if you do it through the UN, with a one vote rule, you will have more of a say. So there is even a divide there of how to achieve this.
So you're just reminding me that I worked at the UN, or the U.S. mission to the UN for 2 years, and this concept of forum shopping, okay? That you look for the forum in which you think there are going to either be sympathetic other countries, or that is, their mission is going to be more supportive of what it is you're trying to accomplish. So really interesting stuff. I have lots of other questions, but I hope others do too. But I wanted to turn to you and help us. Are there big players in AI that are from the Global South? I mean, who are the dominant players in the AI world, and do you understand it as capabilities of nation states, or is it capabilities of various actors? Yeah.
Well, back to Luis's point, I think it depends on how they identify themselves. But yes, there are players. India has a burgeoning tech market. China, of course, if you consider them part of the Global South. And there are a number of other nations that are focused on it as well. I mean, right now, what we're experiencing is a real AI race in the same sense of the space race that occurred in the 50s and 60s. And we have a number of emerging U.S. companies who currently are dominating the space, and you also have some European and at least one Chinese state organization that is pushing these technologies as well. And it's relatively ungoverned. So, like I said, going back to the basic rules that are in place, we're not supposed to impersonate people. We're not supposed to defame people. We're not supposed to infringe on copyrights. Those laws are already in ink. But besides that, the misuses of artificial intelligence for disinformation are relatively new, and so there's great opportunity, across the board, whether it's in the U.S., Europe, or China, to take these technologies in any direction they want to, whether it's nefarious or not. Most recently, I think it was last week, we saw an allegation. These reports require some more analysis, but there was at least an allegation that PRC China was starting to use AI for the development of online personas and automation of content online, which is not a good sign. China, which has just issued its own AI policy saying do not misuse AI, is apparently already using AI to misinform or to do bad things. So very confused system of companies and organizations that are up and running, and there's lots of interaction between all of them as they work together sometimes to develop the next technology.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I really encourage you all to, if you want to ask a question, you can come to the mic. So one of the other topics that this panel, that we three had agreed to cover, is, who are the spoilers? Who are the outliers or the players, whether they are nation states or non-state actors, that really don't like the concept of the preservation of the global commons, the need for international cooperation. So I want to invite you both to identify, who do you think are the bad guys in these issues? That we put a lot of issues on the table, but are there countries that are just predictably negative about the role of global governance, or that want to be outside of a system that is regulated and sets norms? Are there nefarious actors that may be attributable to a state or maybe not? That you could have citizens of a peaceful country that are also AI bad actors. So I just want to put on the table this concept of who are the spoilers, and what does being a spoiler mean in the topic that we're trying to grapple with today. Are there countries, and I think we got a foreshadowing of it in Ron's panel of when Jamil made that very clear and very important distinction between the countries for whom protecting sovereignty is paramount and who really do resist a little bit the logic of international cooperation. So we got a little bit of a foreshadowing of it, but I'd like to hear both of you. So you've got a system that's working imperfectly, you've got incomplete norms, rules, laws, treaties, et cetera. But while you're trying to get there, it's not just the conflicted interests of normal nation states, but there are some some spoilers out there. So I just want to invite you, if either of you have any ways to think about who are the folks trying to undermine the objective of preserving and sustaining the global commons. Either of you?
Let me go first. I have two answers: the personal answer, or the me answer, and then the answer from these countries. My personal answer is that, as an academic, I see spoilers as actors that violate the rules of the game or that prevent the emergence of rules of the game that we might need in order to protect the commons. That could entail either different countries not respecting these rules, but also different non-state actors, including specifically companies that might be violating or preventing the emergence of these rules. From the point of view of the Global South, it also depends who you're talking with. For some of them, the US is the biggest spoiler when it comes to rules in the Global South, and they will point to the example of the US leaving the Paris Agreement, which was this regulation of what to do in order to prevent climate change. And for them, you cannot trust the US after that. And there is also this idea that great powers are the spoilers because they have benefited so much that they will not adapt these rules. I don't totally agree with that, but I can see that charge being used, and that charge has been used a lot this past week at the UN General Assembly.
Yeah, I think I take a little bit of a different tack on it, just thinking about the issue in terms of AI itself, right? So what we've seen, I think the Russia's full invasion of Ukraine is a great example. What we've already seen during the last year plus has been the use of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, to create deepfakes, one depicting Putin, the other depicting Zelensky, and there are more than that. But that's an indicator that these tools, at the tactical level at least, will be spoilers. They will be used as spoilers. They will upend agreements, and it will be at the tactical level insofar as they're unattributable. So the organizations that are carrying out these operations using GANs or using deepfakes are hiding their hand. And attribution remains one of the most difficult aspects of countering disinformation or countering malign influence. And so it's very difficult to pin down a spoiler and say, you did this, own up to it, don't do it again. And again, there's no prohibition against the uses of these tools yet. So it's a very complex space. I would say, though, that if you're going to name a few, certainly Russia. I think what we're already seeing is some hints that China is already using it. I think, and I'm thinking really probably in terms of U.S. defenses more than multilateral agreements. But I think the U.S. is going to be the target of a lot of the misuse of these technologies over the near term.
Thank you. So I want to just throw a perhaps counterfactual at you, or maybe a little bit of a counterintuitive judgment. If I'm a small to medium-sized country in the global south, I don't know, Uruguay or Kenya or something, I've got the Green Fund now. There's $100 billion a year that is supposed to help countries, adapt to climate change. The Secretary General is saying UN reform is absolutely essential, and it's got to be based on the principle that the voice of the Global South needs to be heard more. We've got to give more power and influence to the Global South in the international system. Some of the new technologies that cyber enables can help small countries develop some national security tools that don't require them to invest in a big standing army, for example. There are some benefits to technology for countries that have not been big militarized countries. I'm just trying, there's statistics from the Sustainable Development Goals that, fewer countries, that poverty is contracting as a human condition, that there are, that the economic realities of the world in some cases are moving in the right direction. Would that more positive view that the Global South is making progress, that they are achieving, and that the international system has in fact responded to some of their expectations, can one make that argument? Or if you're in the Global South, is it still, is the dominant tone, here we are, you know, UNGA week, UN General Assembly week, is it still the list of grievances, or are there members of the Global South who say things are starting to turn in our direction?
Great question. Two answers, a personal and a professional. The personal answer is that for me, that's an accurate assertion, especially because these are countries with limited resources that on their own, they're not going to be able to tackle all of these different problems. At the same time, I think that the material conditions have been changing for a lot of these different rules. The Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Climate Agreement are maybe not that even useful for the current state of the environment today. So maybe there is a need to find ways to adapt this rule or to come up with rules that are adaptable. Personal opinion. Professional opinion, I think that for a lot of these countries, it's not enough. They feel like they gave up a lot of things back when these different institutions were created, expecting for those rules to change, to include them a little bit more, and they have changed. But then you will have this claim of it's not enough, depending also specifically to which countries you ask. The more raising capabilities they have, the more they will say that that change is not enough.
And I guess a last question for you. If you were advising the U.S. government, as I think you continue to do, on smart strategies to limit the kind of global harm from generative AI, would you think the Global South are important players? Would you include them in a strategy to try to build consensus? And if so, are there particular countries of the Global South that you think can be kind of, you know, productive players in this arena?
Yeah, I think absolutely the Global South. I mean, it's essential to coming up with a comprehensive prohibition on the misuse of AI. If you don't have full buy-in, you know, there's always going to be an outsider who's able to have an oversized impact on the rest of the organization. You don't want to upset a state by excluding them from the negotiations. It has to be totally inclusive because this technology is, you know, by nature international and can affect everyone globally. You have to include everybody in the solution to its misuse. I don't know who the Global South outliers would be in particular. It seems to me that, you know, we've already said it essentially, that the increasing cheapness of these technological tools makes them more and more available to the poorer countries of the world and the poorer populations of the world. So it's probably more important than ever that we include all of those voices in the discussion of this problem.
Thank you. Floor is open. Hope that some of you have questions, please. If you want to go for the mic, that would be helpful.
Yeah. I'm Patrick Smith at Georgetown and formerly of the Naval Academy. And so I have a question that sort of relates to combining the two perspectives here, and I think often sometimes gets ignored, right, which is the role of sort of the AI laboring underclass in the Global South in coding the massive amounts of data that these large language models and generative AI rely upon. I think the classic one is, I think, the Philippines right now, where a lot of people in the Global South are being paid comparatively quite poorly in order to code the massive amounts of data on the internet that are then used by that are then used to train the models, right? And so these are absolutely essential to the actuality and the potentiality of these models, and it is sort of a sense in which, now I think this is a governance lever, I think, if you want to change it as well, but it's also, there's a sense in which the companies that are getting rich off of AI and the nations that are going to use these sort of large language models in order to achieve their relevant interests are relying upon this substratum of exploited labor. And I'm just curious to what extent you think that this might actually serve as a potential way to kind of get into a governance mode. It might be a lever by sort of Western countries in terms of regulation, or by the Global South in terms of regulation. So both in terms of maybe limiting how they're used, but also in terms of more equitably distributing the benefits of the new technology.
Yeah, it's really hard to unpack because there are a lot of unknowns behind that. We don't actually know what the level of use of Global South corporations is in the training of these large language models. It's very opaque. When you go to you go to OpenAI or whatever other system and you play around with it, you have no idea where the data is coming from, where it was integrated, how it was trained. Extraordinarily opaque. So it's hard to sort of put your finger on what lever you would press, right, to have an advantage over the potential misuse of that population. But I mean, there's an argument in there that maybe this is a place where a multilateral institution should have some role in dictating the kinds of data that are used or integrated in large language models, and how they are interpreted. That's extraordinarily challenging. If you ask a Govy how they would participate in something like that, they would say, "Oh, I would defer to the tech company because they know how it actually works." So there's this sort of fear of meddling, fear of government meddling in these algorithms and technologies because they assume that the market is going to govern itself and the market is going to sort of fix itself, and it's going to create a product that is capitalistically useful. But that isn't necessarily the case. But I think there's a lot more to unpack there. I'd love to, if you're digging into who is training large language models in the Philippines or wherever else, I'd love to know more about it, and I think everybody else would.
That's something maybe, Doyle, you'll want to discuss with Patrick on the next panel as well. Doyle, I think there was one other question, but Doyle next.
I'm Doyle Hodges. I teach at the Charter School. Just kind of bridging the areas that you both work in. It strikes me that in commons that are defined by commonly held standards, there's an incentive for resource-poor countries to gain a comparative and competitive advantage by flouting those standards. I think for many years in banking, you saw a lot of microstates who their principal advantage was, gee, we really don't care what you put here or how it got here. And I wonder how we avoid the development of that in AI. What are the levers that powerful states have to avoid that sort of loophole as we develop standards for what it is that we want done?
Yeah, another great and difficult question to answer. From my perspective, the U.S. Not as a whole, but industries within the U.S. are moving forward on that standards for AI, especially for there's currently an effort underway to standardize the language for disinformation campaigns. So what is the language being used in those, and how does it go back and forth with the intent of being able to create a kill chain that cuts off those disinformation campaigns? That's one kind of standard that's being developed. Another standard that's being developed is content authentication. Content authentication. Again, this is where we're able to designate who originated the content when it travels across the internet. Those things are U.S.-led and they're corporation-led, and so I think that genie is out of the bottle, and it's going to move pretty quickly, because just like you say, that's one of the great advantages. If you have the standard, you essentially own the entire network of technologies. Every AI technology to come has to then adhere to that standard, whether it's Chinese or Indian or whatever else, in order to play in that market. So I think these companies recognize that. The U.S. companies recognize that, and they're moving forward really quickly.
I think that the common thread between these two questions is also, how do we think about distribution of benefits globally? How do we think about outsourcing cost? And I think that there is a point there about how, for a lot of these countries, the status quo and existing regulations help the states in the global north, in developed societies, but they also help the populations of those countries more and the companies of those countries more. Like those small island states wouldn't be able to have those financial regulations if companies from the developed countries wouldn't use them. At the same time, like these are countries that are also benefiting because they have limited resources, so they need to attract all of these different economic benefits. It's a, ethically speaking, very complicated question. From an IPE kind of perspective, very interesting research question.
Other questions? Kevin, and then Abiel. Kevin, you want to go?
Hello, my name is Kevin. So throughout your talk, thank you, by the way, I got the sense that you're skeptical of multilateral agreements to try and restrict the misuse of AI. I think I personally bring a more private sector perspective on AI because I interned with a Silicon Valley tech company over the summer. And what you see with them is they're very focused on trying to advocate for governance that is risk based and very sector and use specific. So, do you think that that level of nuance that kind of breaks down into more detail different uses of AI and different types of AI rather than AI as a whole, and how that might impact the feasibility of multilateral cooperation? Thank you.
Yeah. I think we're already seeing that segmentation of policy development. And I think that's in recognition of the complexity of AI. Like, what is AI? AI is a massive sort of constellation of capabilities. When I think about AI, I'm focused very strongly on its potential for the development of disinformation and other problems like that. So, when I've been looking at it, I have seen the segmentation of that disinformation problem as one sort of policy that multilateral institutions are looking at. And I think that's really healthy, and it has to be broken into segments because it is such a complex, complex technology and multiple technologies layered. So, I would agree.
Abiel?
I guess going off the back of all those questions, seeing how maybe a region like Latin America or South America has felt left out because of their role in institutions like the UN, and now they're increasing their cooperation with strengthening bilateral relations with China and things with BRICS. So, assuming we want to counter something like BRICS in the specific region of Latin America because of its proximity to the US, would it be a viable option to maybe 10 years from now increase our sources drastically for influence operations to kind of bring them back in our favor?
Can you ask that in a different way? Just repeat the question, please.
Should we increase our resources for influence operations in Latin and South America to bring them back to our side away from China, which they seem to be warming up to every day?
Yeah, I think so. There are multiple kinds of influence operations, right? So there's diplomacy, there's the military-style PSYOP, and then there's IO influence operations that's conducted covertly. I think that diplomacy has a huge role here, and yes, it's absolutely time to try to bring back good relationships with South American countries and global South countries. That seems pretty straightforward to me.
I would advise two things. One, invest in your expertise in the region, whichever region it is in the global south. It's not so much about the operations themselves, it's about how much you know about them. And was it 2 years ago that the Americas conference happened in LA? Or I don't remember if it was last year, and it was a fiasco because the State Department didn't have enough knowledge about which countries could even come or which countries wanted to participate or what agenda they wanted to talk about because they did not do their homework a little bit better to understand what this country wanted. So invest a little bit more in getting knowledge. And two, point to the problems that you would get into if you work with the competitors. It's not like the Chinese investment has the best track record when it comes to a lot of these different infrastructure projects that they have. And some Latin American countries working with them, especially Peru or even Brazil, they have seen the problems of participating with China and getting a lot of Chinese investment. So know them better and help them see what the problems are of working with someone else that is not you.
Any other, Kathleen?
This might be maybe a clarification of Abiel's question, but to your point, Professor Rodriguez, when you were talking about the disagreement among countries within the Global South is the challenge to trust great powers. And then to your point of these technologies that we see in the Global South and in Africa, the way that they're leading in mobile banking, or Latin America and agro-tech, what is the kind of hammer home what the challenge is to the U.S. to be in these like win-win partnerships with the global South, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that there are different answers there. The encompassing one would be that I think that the U.S. has been phrasing a lot of its cooperation with the global South in general and in Latin America as I am the best answer. I provide the best international order. Everything else will be a spoiler. And that doesn't resonate well with these countries, especially because in Latin America, dealing with US hegemony for much longer than other countries in the world, they have done that. They have been there and they have seen how this helps, it doesn't help that much. I think that it would be better to phrase this as we are a better alternative. And it's something that Biden, for example, had said during this campaign, basically saying, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the best option or to the other option, which is something that the US could say as well. Like, this is the order that I provide. These are the regulations, these are the expectations that you might see. See the problem with the other ones. Choose which one you want to go with instead of it's me or nothing.
So, yes, please.
Hello. I'd just like to thank you both for coming out today. For my part, I'm a global affairs major. I'm a sophomore at the Fairfax campus. Sorry. I was really fascinated by both of your points regarding the future regulation of this emergent AI technology, as well as your unique perspective from the Global South standpoint. But I guess what I was somewhat conflicted about was the idea of the first movers, right? Obviously, it's easy to say that from a realist standpoint, each individual nation will act in its own interest to sort of manage AI in their own way. But my question is, like, how can AI be applied on an international scale? Say, for instance, in the UN itself, or in an organization like NATO. And I guess how then could it be made more unbiased with the predictive models you mentioned, or the language structures, in facilitating justice on an international scale? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. I think there are lots of different parts to it. One is, excuse me, how to actually structure the use of AI in support of an international organization. That's one part of the question. Then the other part, I think, is how do you overcome some of the biases that exist in AI itself and the training models. The structuring in support of an international organization, I think it boils down to the standards we already discussed, and those standards are starting to be developed. Those standards have to be useful to each country involved in the organization, and that can be hard to come to grips with. I'm going to participate in a standards development activity over the next year, and I know it's just going to be a sort of grudge match every time we meet to figure out which word counts and which doesn't. And imagine doing that on an international basis. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult. I think on the issue of fairness and bias of these tools, I think what's going wrong with these tools is the data itself. So these tools have to be trained on a data set, and most of the data that's out there is simply reflecting our own human biases and our own, whether it's sexism, racism, or whatever else it is, or international superiority or whatever else it is. And so the models, the data in the models has to be expanded to include international perspectives, right? It has to include foreign languages, not just English, and the most obscure languages to get the best out of the system that it can offer. But that's a real challenge for a company that's trying to just set up a technology, a feasible, profitable technology in quick order. So tough question.
2 points. One is I'm a professor, at least recommendation, and the other one is much more of a comment. For how international organizations could use AI, there is this postdoctoral fellow at CSAC at Stanford. Her name is Rhiannon Nielsen, and she just published 2 articles where her point is much more normative, but she says that humanitarian interventions, especially blue helmets, should be able to conduct mis- and disinformation campaigns in order to prevent humanitarian crisis. She's getting a lot of pushback, but she's very good at handling that pushback. But it's a fantastic piece that actually talks about how to use these different elements. And then a comment about how to regulate this in a better way. I think that my issue with a lot of regulatory efforts, especially some effective altruist regulatory efforts, is that they seem for me to be very technological optimists, where they believe that the best way to prevent problems with technology is to have better technology. And I think that we should engage more seriously, systematically, into the politics of regulations and also into the issues of fairness in regulations, which is something that political scientists we have been talking about for a long, long time. So maybe there is a dialogue there that needs to happen between technology people and political scientists that have been working on how to regulate this kind of stuff.
Very interesting. So we're going to break a little bit early. I just want to step back and see if I can frame a little bit of what we've heard and invite Luis and JD to make any final reflections. When we think about, step back and just go back to that higher level of what are the commons, and in the course of the day, we've obviously been hearing about a lot of different kinds of commons. So I wonder, Luis, if you would sort of accept the delineation that there's certain of the commons that really affect immediately all of mankind and that really are in the Sustainable Development Goals, and where there shouldn't be access to the oceans and clean water and fishing and humanitarian development and human rights. There's a whole set of issues that are very natural to be thought of as universal goals and objectives of the UN system. Then there are these newer commons areas in which, just like nuclear weapons 70 years ago, it starts out that the big countries own this, so space, cyber, AI, these are all inherently, they emerge from a limited number of countries, and their application may be relevant to these other, you can use space technology to make sure the oceans are clean. You can use all of these applications, in theory, are relevant to the human security commons, but they also have attributes that are going to be more likely developed and invested in by the big countries, right? So whether if you and I are ambassadors from the Global South, how do we have more clout on the human security side of the ledger? But I think your work suggests that you've got to try to assert your power across the board. I'm inviting JD to also think about whether you see the regulations of these dual-use systems. I mean, whether it's satellites or AI or cyber platforms, that they obviously have both immediate military use to the great powers, but they also have a civilian purpose to them. And when we get to setting global rules, is it acceptable to sort of fence off the military use of these tools, or do the great powers have to concede that the rules have got to be for the entire technology, not just the sort of upside part of it? It's a slightly weird question, but I'd like to just invite you to make any final observations with that question in the back of your minds.
Yep. Great question, especially because I think it's very difficult to answer. Let me get at it. I think the bottom line of my answer is that I think that smaller countries have more agency in the construction of responses if they can say and prove that they have a reputation of efficiently addressing those issues, especially when it comes to doing domestically or regionally. Latin America, for example, has two big examples. Mexico won a lot of clout responding to nuclear problems after creating the nuclear weapon-free zone in the 60s. And because of that, they were also very good at trying to influence the NPT, and they have been recognized for that. Costa Rica has been also very influential in building a lot of different environmental responses, including the Paris Agreement, because of how good they have been at managing climate change domestically. So they were able to do that. The problem with the commons, especially when it comes to security, is that because they're everywhere, it's also difficult to see when they're affecting you until it's very close and near to you. It's the same thing with the environment, for example. You don't know that this is such of a problem until it affects you personally. And these countries have also been affected, and if they can prove that they know how to address it efficiently, then maybe they can be more agentic and influential in international responses.
Thank you.
Also a hard question for me. It's hard to even approach it, really. Yesterday, I was having a phone call with an exec at a major social media platform who essentially, barked at me, "Hey, look, we're going to solve cancer with this technology. Don't regulate us right now. I mean, if you do, it's going to shut down the ability to have the positive effects we intend to have." So artificial intelligence is, it's an incredibly creative opportunity for the world, but the downside is so stark that I think it requires some sort of regulation that at least slows down its misuse. And the EU and others have attempted to do this unilaterally with other technologies. The U.S. has always had a standoff position from regulating its own industry. I think that's a real risk for us, and we've got to take a closer look at it. But that's the problem. There's no definitive answer to how you would go about this, and I think at the end of the day, it's a political answer. And that's the deepest problem that we're all facing.
Thank you so much. So as you could tell, this was a really interesting but kind of cats and dogs and elephants and whales kind of panel. We covered a lot of different topics. But please join me in thanking Luis and JD for terrific comments and observations. What I'm going to propose is that we take about a 7-minute break, and then the baton will be handed to Doyle Hodges for for this panel, the next panel on ethics, and then we'll go directly into our final speaker, which is Jamie Metzel, who'll be joining us on Zoom. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.